story is going to be by Marshall Porter, and it's called A Valley to Remember. For most everyone who attended and bought what the auctioneer was offering, it was just another farm sale. Farm women, some of them aging and toil-worn, were still seeking implements of toil such as churns, crocks, rakes, hoes, sewing machines, and quilting frames. Genteel ladies were buying fine old glassware, handmade rugs, and choice antiques to add to their luxurious surroundings. Though a few were well-dressed, most of the farmers wore work-stained overalls and jackets of shiny leather or denim against the biting spring wind. Assorted hats and caps, mostly battered and worn, crowned the heads of these monarchs of the soil, and most of the locks their headgear covered showed a lot of gray. The young grass that was trying to get started in the farmyard was being flattened by muddy, manure-stained rubber footwear. The owner of the farm was a small man. He was bent and gray and looked older than his 65 years. He followed the auctioneer and sale clerk closely and looked fondly at each animal or implement that passed from his ownership to the highest bidder. He did not share the gay, noisy mood of the crowd of strangers who attended his sale. His feelings betrayed of finish and defeat. Neither could I share the crowd's mood of gaiety. From birth to late middle life, I had lived in the valley, and we were neighbors of the Herb Flint family. His sale that day marked the end of an era, a way of life. It was the end of small farming operations in Flint Valley. One by one, such sales had preceded the loss of another family who had ceased farming operations, and now Herb Flint was the last. I had not attended the sale to buy anything, for I no longer had use for such items. I suspect I was there to try to relive, in memory, my earlier life in that valley. Those small, irregular fields where we used to trade work with neighbors to harvest grain and hay were overgrown with briars and sedge grass, and the vacant buildings and the farmyard fences were falling to ruin. I began remembering the valley as it used to be. Wars and rumors of wars and easier and higher paid jobs had drafted or lured the young people away. As the owners grew too old to carry on, they had to lay down their burdens, and another farm in the valley that had nurtured staunch American families for a century and a half was left to go back to the wilderness. Gotta have a sip of coffee, folks. Do you have your beverage? Oh, I love my coffee. Herb Flint was a victim of rumors of wars. Herb's sons ran his sizable dairy operation. Herb had rented an adjoining farm, which he was clearing so as to have land enough to make the dairy profitable. Then his son was drafted into the military service with but 2 weeks' notice. He had to leave his young wife and a child and his aging parents and his partly harvested hay crop in the mid-June. Not with the help of the senator, county agent, Red Cross, or hardship agency were they able to defer induction until after harvest, nor could arrangements be made to find someone to help run the dairy until the son served his 2 years, and this was in 1955, 10 years after World War II was over. The aging father was left to try to carry on alone. The rest of the summer and winter was all that he could endure, and that day he was selling out. 40 years ago I was growing up in that valley. It was teeming with action then. Plowmen could be heard from the hilly pasture fields, and ewes bawled to call their straying lambs. Dinner bells rang at mealtime to bring families together at the table. Nearly a dozen farms gave us 2 weeks of following a steam-powered threshing machine from farm to farm, as we all helped each other thresh our grain crops. One could never forget the fine neighborlessness of the farmers of the valley as they worked together. The women folk helped each other prepare bountiful dinners and suppers for the men. Getting together gave them a little bit of a social life. Many times, to finish a threshing job, we worked until we could see sparks flying from the smokestack of the steam engine, and from the grain stacks see the first lightning bugs in the coming darkness. Finally came the long, shrill blast from the steam whistle that told us we were finished with that neighbor's crop. There was the orderly stampede at the old wooden pump to get water to wash up for supper, and what suppers they were. We were a hungry lot. We had worked from the noon meal until nearly 9 o'clock, with only generous pieces of fruit or squash pie around mid-afternoon. We expected to work long days during threshing time, and no one grumbled about being overworked, even though such a day of working in grain dust often made your bones ache like a dose of flu when you tried to sleep that night. Nor was threshing the only job which brought those neighbors working together. There was butchering, apple cutting, barn building, quilting parties for the womenfolk during the winters. In fancy, I can still hear the chimes of sleigh bells breaking the silence of our valley on cold, clear winter nights. I hear the gay voices of our young people, my own among them, when we went on sleighing parties to dances, surprise parties, and church socials. Every home in the valley was home to all of us, and I like to think again of the pleasures we enjoyed together. Though the people of the valley were of mixed faiths, it could be said that we worked together, played together, and prayed together. On Sundays, the young folks walked down the dusty or muddy roads in a group and separated at the crossroads, each going to the church of their faith. We met after the services were over and walked home together and got together again that afternoon at the ball ground or swimming pool. In winter, we would skate on the pond or coast from the snowy hillsides. Our mothers were staunch believers in the healing power of prayer, and in cases of illness, when the good mother was nearly worn out caring for a sick member of her family, a neighboring wife would come to her relief. They would pray together for the recovery of the patient, and their prayers were respected and welcomed, regardless of the faith that they practiced. I'm not trying to imply that our valley was a paradise in which the people were saints. Our people were human, and there were the little petty jealousies of families that managed better and seemed to have better luck than others. There were always the tales and jokes about those with stingy or peculiar little traits, but if ever a family was in need of help of any kind, every neighbor would forget any differences and do his or her utmost to help in any way that they could. And then with 1917 came the World War I. The young men left the valley for jobs with higher pay, and the draft took most of the available young men because our farms were not considered big enough to merit deferments for men of draft age. Our young people in the valley began thinning out. Some of them are sleeping in France. None of the others ever came back to the farms to stay. One by one, the owners got too old or died, and the farmers were allowed to grow up with briars and brush. One would have had to live there to know where the fields used to be. There was no great amount of farm products sold from the farms. Butter, eggs, fruit, and vegetables were our main crops. The family food was raised and enough was sold to make the cash income, which was often pitifully small. But these families were self-sustaining and were never out competing for employment in the labor markets. There must be thousands of such desertions of farm communities in our country. From such communities came leaders and statesmen, people of integrity, who earned their bread by the sweat of their brows, with a firm faith that with God's help they couldn't fail. Life was simple then. We knew what it was to work from dawn to dusk, and the blessedness of falling into a peaceful sleep with the night music of whippoorwills and katydids. Let's see. This is called Summertime Work and Play, and I believe this is by Ken Tate. The August sun seared its way into our lives again that day long ago. Another day without rain. Oh well, the crops were long since burned to a golden crisp in the brutal drought. Summer refused to give in to the steadily shortening days, and the relentless onslaught of the season. It was a brutal afternoon for a boy of 12. The breeze, even on the hilltop we called home, refused to blow. The creeks had been reduced to a few tepid water holes, barely able to accommodate hot, tired feet. Even the shade of the huge oaks surrounding our farmhouse refused to give much comfort. The leaves seemed to be losing their lock on life already, 2 months before they should. My pal Chester walked up through the heat carrying his rifle and suggesting an afternoon hunt. "Ah, it's too hot to hunt," I said. "Probably wouldn't see anything anyway." "Come on, Chet," retorted. "I didn't walk 2 miles just to sit here and sweat. Besides, I know a place we can cool off." That hope was enough to pull me away from the front yard and elicit permission from Mama. With my single-shot .22 under my arm, I jawed at Chet as I reached the edge of the yard. "Well, what's keeping you?" Chet was quickly in the lead. Over a couple of hills and the dells between, we plodded. I had been right. Neither rabbit nor squirrel rousted about in the heat. The only sound was the chirp of a cicada and the soft padding of our feet, wary for prey. Instead of directing us toward the third rise, Chet turned parallel to the slope and headed toward an outcropping of rocks. I knew of a cave spring which normally flowed from the base of these rocks. I also knew the water long since had subsided with the drought of the summer, sinking to subterranean rocks. "I found it last week," Chet said, as we neared the cave. A farmer had dug out the mouth of the cave and had run piping back to what must have been a small reservoir. He had built a sizable holding box for the precious water. Lowing of nearby cattle told me his work had not been in vain. At first, Chet and I dipped handfuls of the pure cold spring water, then wetted handkerchiefs for faces and hot, dirty necks. Next, we were sitting on the edge of the box, feet dangling frigidly inside as we talked. Dare led to double dare, and soon we were in the water, where we stayed until the icy water forced us out. By the time we walked home, it was evening. I guess our body temperatures had dropped enough not to notice the heat. That night, the breeze still wouldn't blow, and the house was just as hot. Still, a friend's discovery had helped me make it through another August afternoon on one of the hottest good old days down on the farm. And I'll read one from We Survived and Thrived. Let's see here. This is a short one. It's called Growing Up in the Depression by Myrtle Jones. As young children growing up on a farm, my 2 sisters and I didn't realize that we were poor. When children have loving parents and plenty to eat and a place to sleep at night, they have no problem. We lived in a big old white house on a hill overlooking my father's land and a large pecan orchard. Sometimes that pecan orchard kept us in necessities when other crops failed. It didn't bother us that we had no modern facilities. We never had any. And you don't miss something that you've never had. Our water came from a well just a short distance from the back porch. We had an outhouse, but it wasn't fancy. No colorful paint on the outside, no pictures inside neither. It did have the 2 customary holes, but both were the same size. Not a big one for adults and a little one for children. Mostly I remember how cold it was trying to get to the outhouse with a foot of snow on the ground. Everyone lived the same way we did, or so we thought. I discovered later just how wrong I was. There was always plenty of food as far as I can remember because my folks raised everything from vegetables and fruit of all kinds to chickens, cows, and pigs. Mother canned about everything that was perishable. Without electricity, there were no freezers or refrigerators. After Thanksgiving each year, Dad would butcher 2 to 3 big fat hogs, and the weather had to be cold enough so the meat could cure, not spoil. Dad invited 2 or 3 neighbors and their wives for what we called hog killin' day. The men would kill and dress out the hogs, then cut the meat into hams, shoulders, ribs, and different cuts of meat. The meat was then placed on a large table in the smokehouse and covered with a sugar cure mixture. While the men were taking care of the meat, the women were preparing a real feast that included fresh meat and my mother's chocolate pies. This is the way we almost always celebrated Thanksgiving. Each neighbor would take home several pounds of fresh meat in pay for their help. Our lives went along as smooth as silk until I became a teenager in high school. We rode the bus to a consolidated school in a small town. These high schools were called consolidated because all the small country schools had been consolidated or joined with the high school. My best friend lived north of the school, and I lived east. She was forever insisting that we spend the night with each other. Finally, my mother consented for me to go home with her. I packed a small paper bag, overnight bags were unheard of, and boarded her bus for an overnight visit. The weather was hot, and the bus was crowded, and the distance was unending, as she lived miles out in the country. Finally, the bus pulled to a stop beside a barbed wire fence. All one could see for miles was a pasture with a few scrubby cattle and a small house about a quarter-mile away in the pasture. I thought, surely she doesn't live way down there in that little house, but when I saw her stand to exit, I knew that it was. We were met on the yard by 2 or 3 small children and several barking dogs. Chickens were pecking around in the yard, unconcerned by our arrival. We entered the living room, or front room, as most people called them in those days. I was stunned, to say the least. All this room contained was a bed, 1 dresser, a stand table, and a few cane-bottomed chairs. The stand table held the coal oil lamp and a Bible. My friend's bedroom was even more sparsely furnished, with only a bed, a chair, and a string across one corner for hanging her clothes. The mattress on her bed was stuffed with corn shucks. Lots of people used straw to fill the ticking for a bottom mattress, but they used a cotton mattress on top of the straw one. All these people had were shuck beds, and they were hard as a rock. Their kitchen was equally bare, containing only a wood-burning cook stove, a table with a long bench on each side, and a cane-bottomed chair at each end. The cabinets were boxes nailed to the wall. In spite of these eye-openers, I enjoyed my visit, and I went home a more grateful daughter than I had been the day before. I realized that a lot of people had less than we did. Before, I never thought of our family as poor. Now I knew just how well off we were. Okay, guys, that's it for Sunday's good old days story time. I hope you guys have a wonderful Sunday and know that I'm thinking about you. Blessings.